She didn't come herself. That was the thing I kept circling back to. After, not the knock at the door. Not the box I had already taped up and left in the hallway, because I had known someone was coming and I had wanted the whole thing to be quick and clean and over. Not even what happened after, just that detail, that she had sent her mother instead of coming herself, which told me everything I needed to know about how Priya felt about endings and about me, and possibly about herself. I opened the door at 11 on a Saturday morning and found a woman who was not Priya. She was maybe 60. She had the same dark eyes and the same specific kind of stillness, the kind that isn't passivity, just confidence wearing comfortable clothes. She was holding a cloth bag with a pattern of orange birds on it, and she looked at me the way people look at things they want to understand before they say anything about them. She said, "You must be Ethan." I said I was. She said, "I'm Leela, Priya's mother." She looked past me at the box in the hallway. "Is that everything?" I said it was. She stepped in, not waiting to be invited, but not impolitely either, just with the ease of someone who has long since stopped asking permission for small things, and she picked up the box and turned it over once in her hands, checking the weight. She set it back down. She looked around the apartment, briefly, the way a person looks at a place they are trying to understand through its objects. Then she said, "Did she tell you why she's not here herself?" I said Priya hadn't told me much of anything. She nodded slowly. She said it would be too hard. She set the cloth bag down on the counter, beside the coffee maker. Priya says a lot of things are too hard. I didn't know what to do with that, so I said nothing. "My name is Ethan Marlowe. I'm 32. I do logistics planning for a mid-size freight company, which is exactly as unglamorous as it sounds, but requires a specific kind of thinking that I happen to be good at. Breaking a problem into its moving parts. Figuring out which ones are load-bearing. Finding the most efficient path between where something is and where it needs to be. I live in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor of a building with a slow elevator and good light. I have a coffee maker that I am unreasonably proud of. I had, until 6 weeks ago, a relationship with a woman named Priya Sharma that I had believed was working, right up until the moment she told me, with a lot of sadness and very few specifics, that it wasn't. She said she needed something she couldn't explain. I said I could try to understand if she explained it. She said that was the problem. I have thought about that sentence approximately 400 times since. Leela was still standing in my kitchen. She had not picked up the box again. She was looking at the window, at the plant on the sill, which had been Priya's, and which I had apparently kept watering out of habit, because it was still alive, which was more than I could say for several things. She said, "You kept it alive." I said I'd watered it without thinking. She turned to look at me. She had that quality of attention that some people have, the kind that makes you feel like you are being listened to very carefully, not just heard. She said, "She left it on purpose. Did you know that?" I said I hadn't known that. She said she leaves things behind when she doesn't know how to take them with her. She's been doing it since she was 8. She looked back at the plant. A rabbit, first, then a bicycle, then a boy in secondary school who cried for 2 weeks. She paused. I always end up going back for the things she leaves. I said I'm not a rabbit. She looked at me for a beat. Then she smiled, not a polite smile, a real one, quick and specific, the kind you can't manufacture. She said, "No, you're considerably more complicated than the rabbit." I offered her coffee, because I didn't know what else to do and I had a very good coffee maker. She said yes. I made it. We stood on opposite sides of the kitchen island, and she told me, without being asked, that she had driven 2 hours to collect a box she could see from here wasn't going to fit in the cloth bag she'd brought, which meant she had known before she came that the box wasn't really why she came. I said, "Why did you come?" She wrapped both hands around the mug. She said, "I wanted to see the apartment." I waited. She said, "Priya talked about this place for 2 years. The light, specifically, she talked about the light. She looked at the window again. She talks about places through the things she notices in them. I've learned to listen for what she notices." She was quiet for a moment. She never talked about Daniel's apartment. Not once. She was with him for 1.5 years. I said I didn't know who Daniel was. She said, "Exactly, I did not know what to do with that either, and I was starting to develop a pattern of not knowing what to do with things," Leela said. She said them so quietly and so precisely that each one sat in the room for a while after she'd finished. She asked me how I was doing. Not the way people ask how you're doing, the way that means the question is real. I said I was fine. She said, "Ethan, just my name." Like a door she was holding open. I said, "I don't understand what happened. I've gone back over it 100 times, and I can't find the load-bearing problem. I can't find the thing that broke." I stopped. "That's probably a strange way to put it." She said, "No, it's very you, from what I know of you, which is more than you might think." She set the mug down. "Can I tell you something that Priya would be very unhappy about me telling you?" I said she could. She said she didn't leave because something broke. She left because she got scared. She looked at her hands. Priya has spent most of her adult life being very intelligent and very capable and very careful about not needing things too much. She has a very organized way of wanting things at a safe distance. She looked at me. "You were not at a safe distance. You kept getting closer. Without trying. Just by being how you are." That sentence landed somewhere quiet. I said, "That doesn't make sense as a reason to leave." She said, "No, it doesn't. She knows that. That's why she couldn't explain it to you, because the explanation is not reasonable and Priya only says things she can defend." She smiled again, smaller this time. She got that from me. I have made my peace with it. We stayed in the kitchen for another 20 minutes. She asked about the freight work, and I explained it, and she asked good questions, the kind that showed she was actually tracking the logic and not just being polite. She told me she had spent 30 years as a secondary school science teacher and had recently, upon retirement, taken up competitive chess, which she described as a game for people who enjoy suffering voluntarily. I said that sounded about right. She laughed, sharp and delighted, and then she looked at me for a moment with an expression I couldn't quite read. She said, "You know, when Priya described you, I thought she was." She paused. Chose the next word carefully. "Exaggerating," I said. "She described me to you?" She picked up the mug again. Didn't drink from it. She said constantly, for 2 years, she turned the mug in her hands. She described you the way she describes things she is trying not to want too much, with a lot of very specific detail, and a very careful neutral tone. I looked at the plant on the windowsill. I said, "She left it behind." Leela said, "Yes." I said, "She didn't come herself." Leela said, "No." I said, "But she told you where the light was." There was a pause. Outside the window, something moved. A bird, a cloud, the light shifting the way it does in this apartment in the middle of the morning, which is the thing about this apartment that I have always liked best and which I did not know Priya had talked about until 11 minutes ago. Leela set the mug down very gently. She said, I'm not going to take the box. I said, okay, she said, and I'm not going to tell her I didn't take it. She reached into the cloth bag with the orange birds and took out a card, small, plain, with a handwritten number on it. She set it on the counter beside the coffee maker. That's my number. Not hers, mine. She held my gaze. I'm not doing this for her. I want to be very clear about that. I'm doing it because I drove 2 hours and drank your excellent coffee, and I think you are a person worth knowing, regardless of what my daughter decides to do with her fear. I looked at the card. She said, you don't have to use it. But I would like it if you did. Occasionally, she picked up the cloth bag, which still had nothing in it. I think you are someone who could use a person in his corner who drives 2 hours for reasons she is willing to be honest about. She was at the door when I said, what do I do about Priya? She turned. She thought about it. Really thought, the way she had listened, like the answer deserved the same care as the question. She said, nothing yet. Let her sit with what she did. Priya only understands things once she has had time to be annoyed that she doesn't understand them. She looked at me for a moment longer. She left the plant, Ethan. She knew you'd water it. And then she left. I stood in the kitchen for a while. The plant was on the windowsill. The card was on the counter. The box was in the hallway, untaken, and the apartment was very quiet, and the light was doing what the light does in here at 11 in the morning, which is fall at an angle that makes even ordinary things look considered. I texted Leela 3 days later. I said I had a question about competitive chess and whether suffering voluntarily got easier with practice. She replied in 4 minutes and said, considerably, but only if you stop pretending the suffering is the point. We texted for an hour. I know this because I checked afterward, which is not something I usually do. She called the following Tuesday, in the evening, to tell me about a match she had played that afternoon against a retired engineer, who she described as brilliant and deeply annoying in equal measure. She asked how the freight week had gone. I told her about a routing problem that had taken 3 days to solve. She said, what was the load-bearing piece? And I said, you remembered that. And she said, I remember everything. It's a teacher habit. We can work on whether it's useful. 6 weeks after that, Priya called. She said my name first, just that, and then she was quiet for a moment. I waited. I had gotten better at waiting. She said, my mother said she left the box. I said, she did. She said, she also said she had coffee, a pause. She said it was excellent coffee. I said, it is. Another pause. She said, Ethan, I need to explain something to me about why she stopped. Started again. My mother told me I was being an idiot. I said, she didn't say that to me. Priya said, she didn't have to say it to you. Her voice was quieter. She said it to me for about 40 minutes last Sunday. She brought a chessboard and she won 6 games while she was saying it, which I think was intentional. I heard something shift in the background, the Priya sound of her sitting down, that particular settling. She said, you kept the plant alive. I said, I didn't know you left it on purpose. She said, I know. Then, I leave things behind when I don't know how to carry them. I said, I know. Your mother told me about the rabbit. There was a pause of about 4 full seconds. Then she said, she told you about the rabbit. I said she had. She said, I am going to have a very serious conversation with my mother. I said, she also told me about the boy in secondary school. There was another pause. And then the real laugh, the one I hadn't heard in 6 weeks, the short surprised one that got out before she could manage it, and she said, that was 20 years ago, she has no business. And then she stopped laughing and was quiet and said, more softly, I was scared. I want you to know that I know that. I could not explain it to you, because I could not explain it to myself, and I only say things I can defend, and I could not defend. She stopped. I could not defend how much I didn't want to lose you. She said it like a woman who had been up at 3 in the morning with it, turning it over, and had finally found the version she could say out loud. I said, I know. She said, you know? I said, your mother is very thorough. The laugh again. Quieter, she said, God, then, can I come over? I said the plant was still on the windowsill. She said, I'll be there in an hour. I tidied the apartment in a way that suggested I had not been expecting anyone and was merely a person who lived like this naturally, which I think neither of us believed. I put the box in the second bedroom. I made fresh coffee. I left the card on the counter because it belonged there. She came in and she looked at the apartment, the light, specifically, the way it came through the window at that hour, and she looked at the plant, and she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she saw the card on the counter, and she picked it up, and she turned it over in her hands, and she said, in a voice that was trying very hard to be neutral, she gave you her number. I said. She said she wasn't doing it for you. Priya looked at the card for another moment. Then she set it down, carefully, in exactly the place she'd found it. She turned to look at me, and something in her face was open in a way it hadn't been the last time I'd seen her. Not unguarded exactly, just without the careful distance she usually kept between herself and the things she wanted. She said, I know. She stayed for 3 hours. We drank the coffee. We talked about the routing problem, and the chess match and the rabbit, about which she had considerably more to say than her mother's brief account had suggested. We did not talk about everything. There were things that needed more time, and we both knew it, and we left them the careful space they needed. When she left, she kissed me once, deliberately, the way she does things she has decided to mean. She said, I'm going to be less afraid. I said, I know, it's a process. She said, the plant is ugly, by the way. It's always been ugly. I don't know why I kept it. I said, you left it. She looked at me, opened her mouth, closed it, said, yes. Then she left, and I heard her laughing to herself on the way to the elevator, which is a sound I have never been able to explain and have always been grateful for. I called Leela the next morning. I said, she came. She said, I know. She texted me at 11 last night. She said it went well. I said, did she say anything else? She said the coffee was excellent. I said, that's Priya's highest compliment. She said, I know. I've been translating her for 30 years. She paused. Then, for someone whose job is finding the efficient path between where something is and where it needs to be, you were remarkably patient about the long route. I said I had good company on the way. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, in the particular warm, precise voice of a woman who drives 2 hours for reasons she is willing to be honest about, yes, you did. What would you have done if your ex sent someone else to close the door, and that person opened a different one entirely? And have you ever had someone in your corner who chose to be there for you, not because of who you were to someone else, but just because of who you were? Tell me in the comments. If this one meant something, leave a like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.